One treacherous key sent an entire empire to the slaughter. While Toledo's elite feasted, the steel fist of Alfonso VI was already crushing their throats, preparing a bloody purge, the likes of which Europe had never seen. In a terminal panic, the southern rulers made a fatal mistake. They opened the gates to the beasts of the deep Sahara, warriors who know no fear and take no prisoners. Now, two worlds have collided in a meat grinder so violent that rivers changed course from the piles of the dead. Crusader steel against the black fury of the desert. This isn't a war for land. It's a war of total extinction. You have no idea what a horrific price will be paid for this salvation. The iron scent of blood and rusted metal hung over the Tagus River like a suffocating shroud. For months, the skyline of Toledo had been a jagged crown of defiance. But on this morning, 25 May 1085, the crown was broken. King Alfonso VI did not wait for the sunrise to give the final order. The siege towers, massive wooden behemoths, slick with animal fat to repel fire, groaned as they were pushed toward the Bisagra gate. Inside the walls, the silence of the starving city was more terrifying than the roar of the engines. Men who had once been elite guards now leaned against the battlements, their armor hanging loosely on skeletal frames. Every rib was visible, every breath a struggle. The blockade had done what 1,000 ladders could not. It had hollowed out the soul of the resistance. The first breach did not come from a catapult stone. It came from the shadows of the interior, born of desperation and the cold logic of survival. A group of Mozarab sympathizers, weary of the slow death of famine and the indecision of the local governor, overran the guards at a minor postern gate hidden in the jagged rocks above the river. The heavy oak groaned, the iron bolts shrieked as they were forced back by treacherous hands, and then the flood arrived. Alfonso's vanguard, a sea of steel, mud-stained surcoats, and sharpened halberds, poured into the narrow, winding streets. There was no room for tactical formations or chivalrous duels. It was a visceral slaughter in the dark. Every alleyway became a kill zone where the clash of swords echoed off the stone walls like 1,000 hammers hitting an anvil. Alfonso VI rode through the gates as the first rays of light hit the Alcazar, his black horse stepping over the debris of a fallen civilization. He did not look like a liberator. He looked like a predator claiming a long-sought prize. His eyes, cold and calculating, were fixed on the heights of the city, the strategic plateau that commanded the heart of the Iberian Peninsula. To his left, a squad of alguacils attempted a desperate counterattack, charging down a steep, narrow staircase with daggers and broken spears. They were met by a wall of Castilian shields. The sound of the collision was a sickening crunch of bone and splintering wood. The Christians did not stop to take prisoners or offer terms. They moved with a mechanical, brutal efficiency, clearing house by house, floor by floor, ensuring that no pocket of resistance remained to strike from the rear. By midday, the great mosque had been surrounded by 300 knights. The spiritual heart of the city, once a place of quiet prayer and scholarly debate, was now the final redoubt for the desperate. Smoke from burning granaries choked the air, turning the blue Spanish sky into a bruised, ash-heavy purple. Alfonso's knights dismounted, their heavy iron boots clattering on the intricate mosaic floors as they forced their way into the courtyard. There was no grand speech to mark the moment. There was only the sound of heavy doors being kicked open and the frantic, rhythmic prayers of those who knew the end had arrived. The king's banner, bearing the crimson lions and the golden castles, was unfurled from the highest minaret. Its shadow stretched long and thin over the fleeing crowds, a dark needle marking the start of a new era. The fall of Toledo was not just the loss of a fortress, it was the collapse of a continental frontier. As the news reached the outskirts, the surrounding fortresses began to crumble like dry sand. Commanders who had held their posts for decades saw the royal standard flying over the capital and realized the world had changed in a single morning. The entire Meseta, the vast central plateau that served as the ribcage of Iberia, was now wide open to the Christian sword. Alfonso's cavalry fanned out like a spilled ink blot, seizing 15 villages and 4 major crossroads before the local emirs could even gather their advisors. The speed was the weapon. He did not give them time to mourn or to pray. He gave them only the choice of the sword or the tribute. Panic radiated outward from the city walls like a shockwave. In the markets of Seville and the orange groves of Granada, the name Alfonso was no longer spoken. It was whispered like a terminal curse. The King of Castile was no longer a mere neighbor playing at border wars. He was an existential threat standing at their very throat. He began to demand taxes that would bankrupt the southern kingdoms, mocking their envoys with demands for 5,000 gold dinars and the keys to their northernmost gates. He seized borderlands with impunity, his scouts riding within sight of the southern palaces. The rulers realized that the walls of Toledo had been the only thing keeping the wolf at bay, and now the wolf was not only inside the house, but he was redesigning the rooms. Every hour, the reports at the southern courts grew grimmer. 20 castles surrendered in a single week without a shot fired. 3,000 heavy riders were spotted heading toward the borders of the south, their armor glinting in the sun as a constant reminder of their proximity. The speed of the Christian advance was unprecedented, fueled by the momentum of a victory that felt divinely ordained to the men in the saddles. Alfonso sat in the throne room of the Alcazar, staring at the maps laid out before him, his fingers tracing the routes to the Mediterranean. He did not see the emirs as rivals, but as overripe fruit waiting to be plucked from a dying tree. He knew their internal rivalries, their love for luxury, and their paralyzing fear of his ironclad infantry. The messenger from Seville arrived at the gates of the fallen city on the third day of the occupation. He did not come with a declaration of war or a call to honor. He came with a plea for mercy that went ignored by the guards. As he walked through the plazas, he saw the corpses of the old regime being dragged away by the hundreds, and the new stone garrisons being installed in every tower. He saw the masons already carving the cross into the gates. He realized that the old balance of power was not just tilted, it was shattered. The Christian tide was rising, and there was nothing left in the north to act as a dam. As the sun set on the first week of the new occupation, the shadow of the cross reached toward the distant, trembling borders of the Muslim south. In the heat of the night, 500 miles away, the governors of the remaining territories met in panicked, candlelit circles. They spoke of the ironclad men who fought with the ferocity of demons, and the king who now called himself the emperor of two religions. They knew their walls would be next. They knew their wealth would be confiscated. They knew their children would be subjects of a foreign crown. The fear was a physical weight, pressing down on every council chamber from Badajoz to the coast. There was only one option left, a desperate gamble that every man in the room feared as much as they feared Alfonso. They turned their eyes toward the sea, toward the dark, unforgiving coast of Africa, and the terrifying fundamentalist power that waited in the silence of the Sahara. The decision was made not with hope, but with the trembling hands of men who knew they were inviting a different kind of storm. They drafted the letter to the Almoravids, the desert warriors who broke empires for breakfast. They knew that if these warriors crossed the water, they would never truly leave. But with Alfonso's shadow growing longer every hour, they felt they had no choice but to open the final door. The parchment was sealed. The fast riders were dispatched to the coast, and the fate of the peninsula was handed over to the winds of the strait. The reconquest had reached its first great peak, but a darker, more violent wave was already forming in the deep. The fall of Toledo was not an end, but a terrifying beginning. King Alfonso VI did not spend his days feasting in the halls of the Alcazar, he spent them in the saddle. By June 1085, the central plateau of Spain had become a massive staging ground for a crusade that knew no borders. The king's strategy was simple and devastating: Castilianization by fire. He dispatched 5,000 light cavalry units, known as caballitos, to scour the lands between the Tagus and the Guadiana rivers. These were not noble knights seeking jewels, but professional destroyers. They burned the wheat fields of the south, salted the wells, and cut down any messenger attempting to maintain communication between the fractured Muslim taifas. The message was clear: the old world was dead, and the new master demanded total submission. In Seville, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the stench of fear. Al-Mutamid, the poet king, stood on his balcony overlooking the Guadalquivir River, watching for the dust clouds of Castilian scouts. He was no longer the proud ruler who dictated terms to his neighbors. Every morning he received a new report of a lost fortress. 12 outposts in the north had surrendered in 14 days. The fortress of Toledo was seized by a lightning strike of Castilian infantry, placing a Christian dagger directly into the heart of the eastern territories. Alfonso's demands grew more insulting with every sunset. He sent a delegation to Seville demanding not just gold, but the right to install Christian garrisons in the city's defensive towers. It was a demand for a slow, humiliating suicide. Al-Mutamid knew that his fellow emirs in Badajoz and Granada were already crumbling. The ruler of Badajoz, Al-Mutawakkil, had tried to buy peace by handing over 3 key border towns, only to find Alfonso's troops demanding 4 more the following week. The Christian king's hunger was bottomless. He had adopted the title Imperator Totius Hispaniae, Emperor of all Spain, and he intended to make the title a reality through blood. In the council chambers of Seville, the nobility argued in circles. Some suggested doubling the tribute, while others whispered about a desperate final charge. But the reality was written in the steel of the north. The Taifa armies were fragmented, reliant on mercenaries who were already deserting to join the winning side. The psychological warfare was as brutal as the physical. Alfonso began sending his tax collectors with thousands of heavily armed guards who would camp outside the gates of Muslim cities for weeks, singing hymns and sharpening their blades in full view of the inhabitants. They didn't even need to attack. The sheer pressure of their presence caused the local economies to collapse. Trade stopped. The Silk Roads from the south were cut. Prices for basic grain tripled in Seville and Granada. Mothers looked at their children and saw a future of servitude. The golden age of the Taifas was being strangled by a king who viewed their culture as a luxury he could no longer afford to tolerate. By the end of the month, Alfonso's reach extended to the very edge of the Sierra Morena. His scouts were now so bold that they watered their horses in the streams within sight of the great mosque of Cordoba. He was no longer just a king, he was a force of nature, a mountain moving south. Al-Mutamid realized that the reconquest was not a series of battles, but a systematic erasure. The Christian knights were rebuilding the Roman roads, turning them into arteries for invasion. Every castle they took was immediately refortified with thicker walls and deeper moats. They weren't just passing through, they were rooting themselves into the earth. The breaking point came when Alfonso's envoy, a man with a scarred face and an iron cross around his neck, entered the court of Seville and spat on the floor. He told Al-Mutamid that the King of Castile considered the southern rulers nothing more than temporary tenants on his ancestral land. The demand was now absolute, total annexation of the northern territories of Seville, or total war. The court fell into a deathly silence. For the first time, the music in the palace stopped. The luxury of the poets and the philosophers was replaced by the cold, hard sound of a clock ticking toward an inevitable massacre. Al-Mutamid met with his advisors in a secret bunker beneath the palace. The maps on the table were covered in red ink, marking the progress of the Castilian advance. It was a map of a dying kingdom. He looked at the faces of his generals and saw only defeat. They were men of the city, men of the library and the counting house. They were not built to face the iron-willed fanatics coming from the north. The King of Seville realized that if he did nothing, his sons would be the last of their line. He looked toward the south, toward the sea that separated them from the wild, untamed fury of the African desert. The risk of calling the Almoravids was legendary. They were known as the Veiled Ones, fierce Berber warriors who viewed the refined Muslims of Spain as weak and decadent. To invite them was to invite a lion into your house to kill a wolf. But as the sound of Castilian drums began to echo from the northern hills, Al-Mutamid's fear of Alfonso finally outweighed his fear of the desert. He picked up his pen, his hand trembling slightly, and began to write the letter that would change the course of the world. He knew he was signing away his independence, but he refused to sign away his faith. The riders were prepared in secret. They were given the fastest Arabian horses and told to ride until the beasts dropped dead, then find another and keep going. They had to reach the coast before Alfonso's scouts closed the final gap. The message was a desperate cry for help, a plea to Yusuf ibn Tashfin to cross the water and save the remnants of Al-Andalus from the Iron Emperor. As the riders disappeared into the night, heading for the ports of the south, the first fires of Alfonso's scouts could be seen on the horizon. The trap was closing, and the only way out was to jump into a different fire. Alfonso VI, sitting in his tent on the slopes of the mountains, watched the distant lights of Seville. He felt the victory in his bones. He believed he had already won. He did not know that across the narrow strip of water, a black tide was already starting to stir. He was prepared for a war of kings and castles, but he was not prepared for the storm that was about to blow in from the Sahara. The emperor of two religions was about to meet a man who recognized only one. The air inside the hidden chambers of the Seville Alcazar was thick with the scent of expensive oud and the cold sweat of terrified men. Outside, the fountains bubbled with a tranquility that felt like a mockery of the chaos approaching from the north. Gathered around a massive marble table were the three most powerful rulers of the remaining Muslim south: Al-Mutamid of Seville, Al-Mutawakkil of Badajoz, and the representative of Granada. They were men of silk and poetry, rulers of a sophisticated civilization that had spent more time building libraries than sharpening blades. Now they were shadows of their former selves, huddled together like sheep as the howl of the Castilian wolf grew louder with every passing hour. Al-Mutawakkil of Badajoz was the first to speak, his voice cracking with the weight of recent losses. He detailed the systematic destruction of his border forts. "Alfonso does not just take land," he whispered, gesturing to a map stained with wine and ink. "He erases it. He burns the olive groves that take 40 years to grow. He salts the earth so that nothing will ever rise again. If we do not act, there will be no Badajoz left to defend by the next moon." The others looked away, knowing he was right. The Christian king's strategy of tala, or scorched earth, was draining their treasuries and starving their people before a single siege ladder was even built. The debate quickly turned into a storm of recriminations. The ruler of Granada accused Seville of being too slow to provide military support, while Al-Mutamid countered that Granada had been paying secret tributes to Alfonso for years, essentially funding the very weapons currently slaughtering their brothers. The room was a microcosm of the fragmentation that had allowed the Christians to advance so far. For 200 years, they had fought each other for small hills and minor titles, and now the bill for their disunity had finally come due. The realization was bitter. They were too weak to fight Alfonso alone, and they were too distrustful to fight him together. Then Al-Mutamid rose, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a desperate resolve. He produced a scroll sealed with the signet of the Almoravids, the fundamentalist Berber empire that now controlled most of North Africa. "There is only one force that can stop a man who calls himself an emperor," he declared, his voice echoing off the high-domed ceiling, "and that is a man who recognizes no king but God. I have sent word to Yusuf ibn Tashfin. I have asked the Almoravids to cross the strait." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. To the refined elite of Al-Andalus, the Almoravids were not just allies. They were a terrifying unknown, veiled desert warriors who viewed the Andalusian culture of music, wine, and philosophy as a sin against the divine. The governor of Granada slammed his fist onto the table. "You are inviting a desert storm into a garden," he shouted. "The Almoravids will not distinguish between the cross of Alfonso and our mosques. They will see our gold, our poetry, and our comforts, and they will take them. Once they cross that water, they will never leave. They will turn our cities into military camps and our palaces into stables." It was the ultimate dilemma: surrender to the Christian king who would tax them into oblivion, but perhaps let them live in their homes, or call upon the African Berbers who would likely destroy their way of life from the inside while defending their faith. Al-Mutamid's response became the most famous line in Spanish history, a sentence that sealed the fate of the peninsula for centuries. He looked his peers in the eye and said, "I would rather be a camel driver in the deserts of Africa than a swineherd in the fields of Castile." The words hit the room like a physical blow. It was the choice of a man who preferred a hard life under a harsh ally to a humiliated life under a foreign conqueror. The religious duty to defend the land of Islam finally outweighed the political fear of losing their autonomy. One by one, the other rulers bowed their heads in grim agreement. The gamble was set. The technicalities of the invitation were brutal. The Almoravids did not work for free, and they did not work as mercenaries. Yusuf ibn Tashfin had already sent a preliminary response through a secret channel. If he crossed, he would demand the port of Algeciras as a base of operations. This was a knife to the throat of the south, giving a foreign power the keys to the gateway between two continents. The emirs argued for 3 more hours, trying to find a middle ground, but every time a messenger arrived with news of another Castilian cavalry raid, their resolve to resist the African intervention weakened. Alfonso was a present nightmare. The Almoravids were a future fear. Just as the sun began to rise, a breathless scout burst into the chamber. He didn't even wait to be announced. "The king's vanguard has reached the banks of the Guadalquivir," he gasped. "They have burned 30 villages in the last 2 days. The smoke can be seen from the city walls. Alfonso has sent a message. He expects the keys to Seville by the feast of St. John, or he will level the city to the last stone." The time for debate was over. The physical reality of the Christian army, only a few miles away, crushed any remaining hesitation. The emirs watched as Al-Mutamid applied the final wax seal to the formal invitation. The mission was now a race against time. The riders had to bypass the Christian blockades that were already starting to encircle the southern ports. They carried the fate of an entire civilization in a leather pouch. Al-Mutamid stood by the window and watched the riders disappear into the morning mist, heading south toward the sea. He knew that by this time tomorrow, the news would reach the Almoravid camps in the Sahara. He knew that the drums of the desert were about to meet the trumpets of the north. As the meeting dispersed, the rulers did not look at each other. They walked out of the hall as men who had just signed their own death warrants, one way or another. The luxury of the palace suddenly felt thin and fragile, like a house of cards in a rising wind. The peace of the south was over. The council of the damned had made its choice, and now all they could do was wait to see which monster would devour them first. The air in Seville turned cold, and for the first time in generations, the residents of the city heard the sound of the great gates being barred shut for a war that would have no end. The journey across the strait was a passage between 2 different worlds. When the Andalusian ambassadors stepped onto the sun-scorched sands of the African coast, they felt like ghosts in a land of iron. They were led deep into the desert, far from the lush gardens and marble fountains of Seville, until they reached the massive encampment of the Almoravids. There were no palaces here. Thousands of black goatskin tents stretched across the horizon like a dark sea, and the only music was the rhythmic, bone-chilling thrum of 1,000 war drums. This was the headquarters of Yusuf ibn Tashfin, a man who lived on dates and camel milk, and had conquered an empire while sleeping on the bare earth. The ambassadors, dressed in their fine silks and smelling of rosewater, felt a cold wave of judgment from the desert warriors. The Almoravids were the veiled ones, men who covered their faces with the litham, leaving only their eyes visible, piercing, predatory eyes that had seen 1,000 battles in the Sahara. To these nomads, the rulers of Spain were not brothers in faith, but decadent weaklings who had traded their souls for wine and soft beds. When Al-Mutamid's envoy presented the gold-encrusted letter, Yusuf ibn Tashfin did not even look at the treasures brought as gifts. He stared at the parchment as if he could see the blood already drying on it. The negotiation was brief and brutal. Yusuf was 80 years old, but his mind was as sharp as a Berber scimitar. He listened to the reports of Alfonso's atrocities, the fall of Toledo, and the burning of the southern plains. He didn't ask about the size of the Christian castles or the weight of their gold. He asked about their discipline. When told that Alfonso's knights fought with a reckless religious fury, Yusuf merely nodded. "The desert has taught us that the hottest fire burns itself out the fastest," he remarked. He agreed to cross the water, but his price was absolute. The Almoravids would not be subjects. They would be the masters of the campaign. As the formal agreement was signed, the encampment erupted into a frenzy of preparation. This was not the slow mobilization of a European feudal levy. This was the awakening of a war machine that moved with the speed of a sandstorm. 1,000 desert riders, mounted on lean, tireless camels and Arabian stallions, began to congregate at the ports of Ceuta and Tangier. They brought with them weapons the Spaniards had never seen, long flexible pikes designed to unhorse heavy knights, and massive shields made of multiple layers of hippopotamus hide that could stop a crossbow bolt at point-blank range. The most terrifying element was the psychological preparation. The Almoravids didn't just prepare their weapons, they prepared their spirits. The air in the camp was thick with the chanting of verses and the sharpening of steel. Unlike the Taifa kings, who used mercenaries, every Almoravid soldier was a volunteer for a holy cause. They moved with a terrifying silent discipline that chilled the Andalusian envoys to the bone. They realized that they hadn't just invited an army, they had summoned a force of nature that functioned as a single, lethal organism. Back in Seville, the news that the Veiled Ones had accepted the call hit the city like a thunderclap. The population was divided between relief and a new, deeper fear. Alfonso VI's spies immediately reported the movement across the water. The Christian king laughed when he heard of the camels and the desert nomads. He believed his heavy cavalry, the finest in Europe, would simply ride over the shrouded beggars. He sent a mocking letter to the coast, telling Yusuf to save himself the trouble of crossing, as the King of Castile would soon come to Africa to collect his taxes in person. It was a mistake that would haunt the house of Jimenez for generations. The logistics of the crossing were a feat of ancient engineering. Hundreds of transport ships were gathered, and in a single, massive operation, the Iron Tide began to flow across the Strait of Gibraltar. As the first Almoravid units stepped onto Spanish soil at Algeciras, they didn't head for the cities or the markets. They immediately began digging trenches and building fortifications. They treated the land of Spain not as a prize to be enjoyed, but as a battlefield to be won. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was the last to cross, carrying only his prayer rug and his sword. As the Almoravids moved inland, the atmosphere of the war changed. The scorched earth policy of Alfonso met its match. The desert warriors didn't need supply lines. They lived off the land with a brutal efficiency that baffled the Christian scouts. They moved through the mountains like shadows, appearing where they were least expected. The Christian vanguard, which had been raiding the south with impunity, suddenly found its scouts returning with empty saddles, or not returning at all. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and the psychological edge Alfonso had held since the fall of Toledo began to evaporate. Al-Mutamid met Yusuf at the border, hoping for a grand reception. Instead, he found a man who refused to sit on a throne and spoke only of the upcoming slaughter. Yusuf looked at the luxury of the king of Seville's tent and spat on the ground. "You have built a paradise of glass," Yusuf said, "and the Christians have brought the stones. I am here to build a wall of iron." The alliance was a marriage of convenience between a poet and a butcher, held together only by the shared shadow of the cross. The stage was now set for the ultimate collision. In the north, Alfonso VI was calling in every vassal, every knight, and every mercenary from across the Pyrenees. He was gathering a grand army of the cross to end the Muslim presence in Iberia once and for all. In the south, the black flags of the Sahara were unfurled, and the drums began a beat that could be heard for miles. Two civilizations, two ideologies, and two unstoppable leaders were marching towards a small dusty plain known as Sagrajas. The world held its breath as the veiled storm and the Iron Emperor drew their blades. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of two worlds colliding. Alfonso VI, fueled by the arrogance of his victory at Toledo, abandoned his sieges in the east and moved with a fury that outpaced his own supply lines. He summoned every able-bodied man from the rugged mountains of Galicia to the plains of Leon. His army was a glittering forest of steel, 2,500 heavy knights in hauberks of interlocking rings, supported by 1,000 professional infantry and crossbowmen from across the Pyrenees. Alfonso was not just fighting for territory, he was fighting for the total dominance of the cross. He believed his heavy cavalry was invincible, a divine hammer that would shatter the desert beggars upon the first impact. He pushed his men through the heat of the summer, his banners, the lion and the castle, snapping in the wind like the wings of a predator. To the south, the Almoravid advance was a different kind of nightmare. They didn't march. They flowed like a dark, silent river of oil. Yusuf ibn Tashfin had brought 15,000 seasoned warriors, men who considered death in battle a direct gate to paradise. They moved with a terrifying, rhythmic discipline, governed by the relentless beat of the tables, massive drums made of wood and animal hide that could be heard 5 miles away. The sound was a psychological weapon, a low, guttural vibration that unsettled the horses of the Christian scouts and kept the Andalusian emirs in a state of constant, shivering anxiety. Yusuf rejected the luxury of the Spanish cities, camping instead in the open fields, turning every resting spot into a fortress of trenches and pikes. The two armies converged on the plains of Sagrajas, near Badajoz, a place that would soon be renamed Zalaka, the slippery ground, because of the sheer volume of blood that would soak the soil. Alfonso took the high ground, his camp a city of silk and steel overlooking the valley. He looked down and saw a sight that confused his generals, not a disorganized mob of nomads, but a perfectly aligned grid of black tents and sharpened stakes. The Almoravids had dug in, their front lines composed of a wall of shields and long spears, backed by the elite Black Guard, 3,000 personal bodyguards of Yusuf who fought with curved scimitars and bucklers made of boiled leather. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like a physical pressure on the lungs. For 3 days, the armies sat in a deadly stalemate, exchanging insults and small skirmishes. Alfonso sent a mocking letter to Yusuf, offering to let the African guests leave with their lives if they surrendered their camels and went back to the desert. Yusuf's response was written on the back of the same parchment. What you will see is not what you will hear. The Christian king, sensing an easy victory against an opponent he deemed primitive, ordered a full-scale assault for the following dawn. He didn't wait for his rearguard to arrive. He wanted the glory of the slaughter for himself. As the sun began to set on the final day of peace, the Almoravids performed a ritual that chilled the hearts of the Spanish scouts watching from the ridges. Thousands of men knelt in perfect silence, their faces veiled, their eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no shouting, no drinking, and no boasting, only the whetting of stones against steel and the low, constant hum of prayer. In the Christian camp, the night was filled with the sounds of a medieval army, the clanking of armorers, the neighing of war horses, and the confident laughter of knights who believed they were about to participate in a glorious hunt. They didn't know that the desert warriors had been training for this specific terrain for decades. Yusuf ibn Tashfin spent the night inspecting the lines. He moved like a shadow through the tents, checking the tension of the bowstrings and the depth of the defensive trenches. He knew Alfonso's weakness, pride. The King of Castile would lead with his heavy cavalry, expecting the Almoravid center to buckle and break. Yusuf adjusted his formation, placing the Andalusian Taifa troops, who were the least reliable, in the front to absorb the initial shock, while his elite Berber shock troops remained hidden behind a small rise in the ground. It was a trap designed to swallow the flower of Spanish chivalry whole. The first light of October 23, 1086, broke through a thick, cold mist that clung to the valley floor. Alfonso VI mounted his massive destrier, his gold-plated helmet reflecting the pale sun. He raised his sword, and 2,000 knights lowered their lances in a single, terrifying motion. The sound of the horses starting their gallop was like a landslide. "Santiago!" the Christians roared, their voices drowned out by the sudden, explosive thunder of the Almoravid drums. The slippery ground was ready. The two tides of iron were seconds away from a contact that would determine whether Spain remained a land of cathedrals or became a province of the Sahara. Alfonso felt the momentum of the charge, the wind whistling through his visor, the sheer power of 500 tons of armored horse and man hurtling toward the enemy. He saw the wall of shields ahead and accelerated, expecting the line to shatter like glass. But as the first lance struck the first Almoravid shield, the sound was not the snap of wood, but the deep, hollow thud of a mountain being hit. The line didn't break. It groaned, it bent, but it held, and then, from the flanks, the black flags of the Sahara began to move. The trap was sprung. The collision was a symphony of shattering wood and screaming iron. Alfonso's heavy cavalry hit the Almoravid front lines with the force of a falling mountain, but the wall of shields did not dissolve. Instead, the desert warriors dropped to one knee, bracing their long pikes against the earth, impaling the charging destriers. The momentum that Alfonso relied on became his greatest enemy. The knights in the back pushed those in the front directly onto the Berber spears. In the center, the Andalusian Taifa troops fled almost immediately, but this was exactly what Yusuf had planned. As the Christians chased the retreating emirs, thinking the day was won, they broke their own formation, leaving their flanks wide open to the real nightmare. Suddenly, the rhythmic thumping of the drums shifted to a frantic, aggressive gallop. From behind the northern ridges, Yusuf unleashed his secret weapon, the Black Guard. 3,000 warriors, draped in midnight-colored robes and wielding broad-headed scimitars, swarmed the Christian flanks. They didn't fight with the slow, heavy strikes of European soldiers. They moved with a serpentine speed. Hamstrings were slashed, and horses were gutted from below. Alfonso VI found himself trapped in a whirlpool of steel. His elite guard fell one by one, their heavy armor becoming a metal coffin in the sweltering heat and the slippery, blood-soaked mud. The slippery ground had earned its name as the soil turned into a red marsh that tripped the retreating knights. The King of Castile fought like a cornered lion, his sword notched and his surcoat torn to rags. A Berber spear pierced his thigh, pinning his leg to his horse's saddle, but he refused to fall. Around him, the Grand Army of the Cross was being systematically dismantled. The Almoravid pikes were relentless, pushing the knights into the river, where the weight of their mail did the rest. Yusuf ibn Tashfin sat on his horse atop a nearby hill, unmoved by the carnage, watching the systematic erasure of the force that had taken Toledo. He didn't want a surrender. He wanted a message that would echo all the way to Rome. As night fell, the field was a graveyard of ambition. Out of the 6,000 men Alfonso had brought to the plain, only a few hundred remained in a coherent fighting unit. Under the cover of total darkness, the wounded king was dragged from the pile of corpses by his few surviving retainers. They fled toward the north, leaving behind their banners, their treasure, and the pride of an empire. Alfonso looked back one last time to see the black flags flying over his camp, the drums still beating a terrifying, steady rhythm into the cold air. The reconquest had been halted not by a wall, but by a storm. The aftermath was a cold realization for the kings of Spain. The Almoravids did not return to the desert. Yusuf ibn Tashfin marched into the very cities he had saved, but he did not come as a guest. He looked at the palaces of Seville and Granada and saw decadence that needed to be purged. Within months, the emirs who had invited him were themselves being replaced by Berber governors. The camel driver had indeed taken the reins, and the refined civilization of Al-Andalus was being transformed into a rigid military province. The Christian advance was frozen for a century, the border stabilized by the blood of Sagrajas. Alfonso VI reached the safety of Toledo's walls with a shattered leg and a broken spirit. He sat in the same throne room where he had once plotted the total conquest of the south, listening to the reports of the new, iron-fisted rule across the border. He had wanted an empire, but he had instead summoned a protectorate of the Sahara. The map of Iberia was redrawn in a single afternoon of slaughter. The bells of the churches rang for the dead, while in the south, The call to prayer was backed by the weight of African steel. The era of the two religions was over, replaced by a century of total, uncompromising war.